On a dry morning in July 1187, the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood near the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin. The men had marched away from reliable water under a hard summer sun, carrying armor, shields, banners, and the burden of a decision that could no longer be reversed. Around them, Saladin's forces controlled the ground and access to the lake. Smoke drifted across the battlefield as dry grass burned, adding heat and confusion to an army already weakened by thirst. When the fighting ended, the Crusader field army had been shattered. King Guy of Jerusalem was captured, the relic known as the True Cross was taken, and the kingdom's defenses were suddenly exposed. The defeat at Hattin changed the balance of power in the Holy Land with extraordinary speed. Saladin had spent years bringing Egypt and much of Syria under his authority, combining wealth and manpower in a way earlier rulers had struggled to achieve. Now, the principal Crusader army was no longer in the field to stop him. Acre was taken, other strongholds followed, and only a few places offered lasting resistance. In October 1187, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. Many Christian inhabitants were ransomed or allowed to depart rather than facing the kind of massacre that had followed the Crusader capture of the city in 1099. News of Jerusalem's fall crossed the Mediterranean through ships, letters, merchants, and survivors. In Western Europe, the loss carried a weight greater than that of an ordinary military defeat. Jerusalem was the spiritual center of the Crusading idea, the city whose capture had defined the First Crusade. Its loss raised an urgent question. If the greatest achievement of the Crusading movement could be undone in a single season, what had all the earlier victories truly secured? A new crusade was called, and the response came from the highest levels of European power. Three rulers emerged as its central figures: Frederick I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, later remembered as Richard the Lionheart. Their involvement gave the expedition another name, the King's Crusade. Yet these rulers did not share one government, one army, or one political interest. They carried rivalries from Europe, separate chains of command, and different campaign plans. The crusade looked united from a pulpit. On the road, it would be held together only by negotiation and the pressure of a common enemy. Frederick Barbarossa moved first. He was older than the other kings, experienced in war and imperial politics, and capable of assembling a large overland army. His forces marched through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire before entering Anatolia. The journey demanded constant bargaining over food, markets, roads, and passage. Every day required grain for men, fodder for horses, water for animals, and space for camps. The imperial host appeared powerful, but power itself created hunger wherever it moved. In Anatolia, Frederick's army faced difficult terrain, attacks, and shortages, but it continued. For a moment, it seemed that the largest army of the Crusade might reach the Holy Land intact. Then, in June 1190, Frederick drowned while crossing the Salef River in Cilicia. The exact circumstances were reported differently, but the effect was immediate. The emperor, who had held the army together, was gone. Without him, the German expedition began to break apart. Some soldiers continued under Frederick's son, but many turned back or died from disease and exhaustion. An army that had seemed capable of transforming the war was reduced before reaching the main battlefield. Saladin had been threatened by the possibility of Frederick's arrival. Now that danger weakened, photographers devote the first great leader of the Third Crusade had disappeared, not in a famous battle, but in the current of a river. Meanwhile, Richard and Philip prepared to travel by sea. Their cooperation was fragile from the beginning. Richard had only recently become King of England after the death of his father, Henry II, and he inherited lands and responsibilities extending far beyond England. Philip had his own interest in France and watched Richard as both partner and rival. They agreed to campaign together, but neither could forget what the other might do if he gained greater prestige or political advantage. Financing the expedition required taxation, property sales, loans, ships, and months of preparation. Food, horses, armor, crossbows, timber, rope, and siege equipment had to be gathered. The crusade was presented as a spiritual response to Jerusalem's loss, but its movement depended on money and administration. Behind every royal banner stood clerks, merchants, smiths, sailors, and households paying for a war thousands of miles away. By 1190, Acre had become the center of the struggle. Crusader forces were besieging the city, while Saladin's army surrounded them from outside, creating a strange double siege. Men inside Acre watched the Crusaders beyond their walls. The Crusaders watched Saladin's forces beyond their camps. Disease, hunger, weather, and delay consumed both sides. It was toward this coastline that Richard and Philip sailed, carrying forces strong enough to change the campaign. The Third Crusade had begun with the fall of a kingdom and the mobilization of kings. One emperor was already dead. Jerusalem remained in Saladin's hands. Acre had become the place where Europe's remaining rulers would test whether ships, discipline, and royal prestige could succeed where the army of Jerusalem had failed. But beneath the banners and titles, another question was taking shape. Would Richard and Philip fight Saladin? Or would they spend the campaign watching each other? Richard's voyage east did not move in a straight line. Storms scattered parts of his fleet across the Mediterranean, and several ships were driven towards Cyprus, an island ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a Byzantine prince who had established himself there independently. Some of Richard's people were imprisoned, and property from wrecked vessels was seized. When Richard arrived in 1191, the dispute became a campaign. His forces landed, defeated Isaac's resistance, and took control of the island. The Cyprus mattered for more than royal pride. It offered harbors, food, timber, horses, money, and a secure position close to the Holy Land. Richard's conquest gave the crusade a valuable logistical base at the moment when supply was determining whether armies could remain in the field. Richard could move quickly, impose order, and turn an unexpected problem into strategic advantage. By June 1191, Richard reached Acre. Philip II had already arrived, and the siege that had consumed the coast for nearly 2 years entered its final phase. The Crusader camp was crowded with contingents from across Europe, each carrying its own leaders, rivalries, languages, and claims. Disease moved through the tents. Siege engines threw stones toward the walls, while defenders answered from towers. Beyond the camp, Saladin's forces watched for weakness and tried to maintain pressure on the besiegers. The arrival of the two kings brought money, engineers, ships, and fresh soldiers. It also brought competition. Richard and Philip were allies because Jerusalem had fallen, but rivals because their lands and dynasties collided in Europe. A commander gained not only military advantage, but prestige. Even inside a shared crusade, neither king could afford to let the other appear indispensable. Acre surrendered in July 1191. The victory gave the Crusaders a major port and a secure base on the coast. It also produced disputes over banners, prisoners, money, in succession within the Crusader states. Richard supported Guy of Lusignan, while others backed Conrad of Montferrat. Whoever ruled Jerusalem's remaining territories would control castles, ports, revenues, and alliances. The kingdom they were trying to restore already lacked agreement over who should lead it. Soon after the surrender, Philip announced that he would return to France. Illness was part of the reason, but politics mattered as well. His departure left Richard as the dominant Western ruler in the campaign. Yet it also freed Philip to act in Europe while Richard remained far from home. Richard could now direct the army with greater unity, but he knew his continental possessions might become vulnerable in his absence. The surrender of Acre also left thousands of Muslim prisoners in Crusader hands. Negotiations began over ransom, captured relics, and the release of Christian prisoners. The exchange stalled, and in August, Richard ordered the execution of many captives outside the city. It should not be softened into necessity without moral weight. The decision ended the prisoners' value in negotiation and showed how quickly diplomacy could collapse into irreversible violence. Richard then led the army south along the coast toward Jaffa. Ships moved beside the army, carrying supplies and assisting the wounded. The sea protected one flank, while disciplined formations guarded the landward side. Richard understood that Saladin wanted to break the column, isolate units, and exhaust the Crusaders through repeated attacks. He ordered his men to maintain formation and resist the urge to charge too early. The march was punishing. Heat pressed against armor, horses suffered, arrows struck shields, animals, and exposed men. Saladin's mounted archers approached, released volleys, withdrew, and returned. The Crusaders had to keep walking under attack without surrendering their order. Infantry protected the mounted knights, while the knights waited for the command that would allow them to answer. For warriors trained to seek decisive combat, restraint became a form of courage. Near Arsuf on September 7th, 1191, the pressure reached its height. Saladin's forces attacked repeatedly, hoping to disrupt the Crusader line. The Hospitallers, positioned near the rear, suffered heavily and eventually launched a charge. Richard then committed the rest of the cavalry. The Crusader counterattack struck with enough force to drive back Saladin's army and secure the field. Arsuf became Richard's most celebrated victory in the Holy Land. It demonstrated discipline, timing, and his ability to control a difficult march under pressure. Yet the battle did not destroy Saladin's army. Saladin withdrew, preserved much of his force, and remained capable of defending the interior. Richard had won the coast and proved that the Crusader army could defeat its opponent in open battle. I had not solved the problem of Jerusalem. After Arsuf, the Crusaders occupied Jaffa and strengthened their position along the coast. Ships could supply them more reliably, and the road north toward Acre was more secure.
Lower it steady now.
Richard had rebuilt a western foothold that had seemed close to collapse after Hattin. Jerusalem, however, lay inland, beyond hills, uncertain roads, and a defender who understood that Richard's strength was greatest near the sea. As the army rested near Jaffa, armor was repaired and horses watered beneath the late summer sun. Men spoke of the road to Jerusalem as if victory at Arsuf had opened it.
Look there, just past
Richard
the ridge.
knew the truth was more difficult. Winning a
Likely just
battle
goats
was
in the
not the
haze.
same as holding a sacred city far from the coast. The Lionheart had arrived, taken Cyprus, helped capture Acre, and defeated Saladin in the field. The next decision would require something harder than courage, knowing whether Jerusalem could be reached without losing the army needed to defend it. After Arsuf, Richard controlled the coastal road south of Acre and had given the Crusader army something it badly needed: confidence. Jaffa was secured, ships could bring food and equipment, and the army no longer seemed trapped between Saladin's cavalry and the sea. Yet the victory had not opened Jerusalem in the way many pilgrims imagined. The holy city lay inland, beyond hills, narrow roads, uncertain wells, and the countryside Saladin could strip of supplies. Richard understood that the closer he moved toward Jerusalem, the farther he moved from the ships that made his campaign possible. The next stage would therefore be decided not only by courage, but by weather, distance, food, and the ability to hold together a divided alliance.
The army advanced inland late in 1191.
Rain-soaked tents, damaged equipment, slowed wagons, and turned roads into mud. Crusaders who had endured arrows along the coast now fought cold, exhaustion, and the daily labor of moving siege equipment through difficult country. They reached Beit Nuba, close enough to Jerusalem that the final assault seemed near. But Richard's scouts and advisors saw a more dangerous picture. Saladin's forces remained active, the road to the coast was exposed, and the army lacked a secure way to supply a long siege. Even if Jerusalem fell, holding it against a counterattack might prove impossible. Richard ordered the army to withdraw. The decision was strategically cautious and emotionally devastating. Many crusaders had taken the cross for one purpose, and they could not understand why a king famous for courage would turn away when Jerusalem was so near. Some accused him of placing calculation above the sacred vow. Richard feared that an army weakened outside Jerusalem might lose not only the city, but Jaffa, Acre, and every coastal gain made since his arrival. He chose to preserve the force in his hands rather than risk it for a victory that might not survive the following season. The Crusaders moved toward Ascalon, whose fortifications had been damaged by Saladin. Richard ordered the walls rebuilt, and the army spent months lifting stone, clearing ruins, and restoring a position that could threaten the road between Egypt and Syria. The work lacked the emotional power of marching toward Jerusalem, but it served a strategic purpose.
According to this,
Saladin's strength depended partly on communication between his Egyptian and Syrian territories, and a strong crusader base at Ascalon could place pressure on that connection. Once again, the war became a contest of roads, ports, and supply, rather than a simple duel between two famous leaders.
Diplomacy continued throughout the winter. Richard and Saladin did not meet face to face, but envoys moved repeatedly between their camps, often through Saladin's brother Al-Adil. Proposals included territorial divisions, access to holy sites, prisoner exchanges, and even a possible marriage between Richard's sister Joan and Al-Adil. The marriage plan never became reality, but it reveals how flexible negotiation could become when military victory remained incomplete. Both sides could speak the language of holy war while exploring arrangements that would have seemed impossible at the beginning. Political conflict inside the Crusader camp made every negotiation harder.
Richard supported Guy of Lusignan as king of Jerusalem, while many local barons preferred Conrad of Montferrat, whose defense of Tyre had helped preserve the remaining Crusader position after Hattin.
I will not yield.
By 1192, support shifted toward Conrad, and Richard accepted the choice. Before Conrad could establish himself fully, however, he was assassinated in Tyre by members of the group later known in the West as the Assassins. The motives remained debated, and accusations spread quickly among rival factions. Isabella of Jerusalem soon married Henry of Champagne, Richard's nephew, while Guy received control of Cyprus. In the spring of 1192, the Crusader army advanced toward Jerusalem a second time. Once more it reached the region of Beit Nuba, and once more the possibility of attacking the city divided the leadership. Some urged an immediate siege, arguing that further delay would destroy morale. Others proposed striking toward Egypt, where Saladin's resources might be more vulnerable. Reports warned that water near Jerusalem might not sustain the army, while Saladin had strengthened the defenses and prepared to deny the Crusaders food. Richard again concluded that the city might be taken, but could not be held. The second withdrawal ended the realistic possibility of recovering Jerusalem during the Third Crusade. Richard's enemies called it hesitation, but his decision reflected the central problem of the campaign. Victories had not removed Saladin's army or changed the geography of the interior. Richard could win near the coast, where ships supported him. Jerusalem required time, unity, and resources he no longer possessed. News from Europe warned that Philip II was threatening Richard's lands in France and that his brother John was exploiting his absence. Every additional month in the east increased the danger at home. Then, in July 1192, Saladin struck at Jaffa. His army entered much of the city, while the remaining defenders withdrew into the citadel. If Jaffa fell, the coastal system Richard had built would be broken, and the Crusaders might lose the position that made every earlier victory meaningful. Richard was in Acre when the news reached him. He gathered a small force, boarded ships, and sailed south toward a city already surrounded by Saladin's banners. The campaign that had twice stopped before Jerusalem now turned toward one final battle on the shore. Richard's ships reached Jaffa before Saladin's army had completed its victory. From the water, the English king could see Muslim banners inside much of the city and Crusader defenders still holding the citadel. He ordered an immediate landing. Sailors, crossbowmen, knights, and infantry moved through the surf, while defenders on the walls recognized the royal banners below. The sudden attack surprised Saladin's troops, and Richard forced his way back into Jaffa. A city that had seemed lost was recovered in a sudden reversal. Saladin returned within days and attacked again. Richard had few mounted knights, so he organized a compact defensive line with spearmen and crossbowmen. Stakes were driven into the ground to protect the infantry from cavalry, while the crossbows fired in disciplined rotation. Saladin's horsemen charged repeatedly, but failed to break the formation. Richard then led a counterattack that forced the attackers away from the city. Jaffa became the final major battle of the Crusade, and another demonstration of Richard's command under pressure. But the victory did not change the larger reality. Richard was ill, his army was reduced, and the political situation in Europe demanded his return. Saladin's forces were exhausted, but they still controlled Jerusalem and the interior. Neither side could achieve complete victory without risking the gains already made. Richard might win another battle, yet every week increased the danger that Philip II would take his lands in France. Saladin could continue resisting, but years of war had strained his treasury, horses, and commanders. Negotiations accelerated. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce, usually known as the Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but unarmed Christian pilgrims were permitted to visit the holy places. The Crusaders retained a narrow coastal strip centered on Acre and Jaffa. Ascanius fortifications were dismantled because neither side would accept the other holding such a strategic position securely. The treaty was not a grand peace, but a practical pause created by exhaustion and mutual limitation. For Richard, the settlement preserved the Crusader presence in the east, but left the central promise of the expedition unfulfilled. He had captured Cyprus, helped take Acre, defeated Saladin at Arsuf, recovered Jaffa, and restored a defensible coastline. Yet Jerusalem remained beyond his reach. For Saladin, the result was also incomplete. He kept the holy city and prevented the restoration of the Old Kingdom, but failed to drive the Crusaders from the coast. Both rulers could claim success, and both had to accept a boundary they once hoped to erase. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192. His journey home became another dangerous campaign. Unable to return safely through territories controlled by enemies, he traveled in disguise across Europe. Near
there in
Vienna,
the corner.
he was
Show
captured by
yourself.
Duke Leopold V of Austria, a crusading rival whose banner Richard had insulted at Acre. Richard was later transferred to Emperor Henry VI and held for an enormous ransom. The hero of the Third Crusade had become the absent king of England. The money was raised through heavy taxation, church treasure, and contributions from across Richard's lands. He was released in 1194, but the cost of the crusade and ransom burdened his subjects. Richard returned to warfare in Europe and spent much of the rest of his reign defending his territories against Philip II. In 1199, he died after being wounded during the siege of a castle in France. The warrior king, remembered for the Holy Land, spent only a small part of his reign in England. Saladin returned to Damascus after the treaty. His authority preserved, but his resources strained. In March 1193, only months after Richard's departure, he died. Later writers praised his generosity and claimed that little personal wealth remained at his death, though such accounts were shaped by admiration as well as memory. His territories did not remain united under one ruler for long. Members of his family divided parts of the Ayyubid realm, and the political unity he had created began to loosen. The deaths of Richard and Saladin did not end the struggle for the Holy Land. The Crusader states survived along the coast, protected
Heave,
by
men,
ports,
heave! Watch
castles,
the ropes!
trade, and reinforcements from
Steady.
overseas.
Bring it about to the left.
Jerusalem remained under Muslim rule, while Christian pilgrims continued to visit under the truce. Later crusades would return with new kings and new plans, yet none would reproduce the same rivalry that later memory built around the Lionheart and Saladin. Their reputations grew because each seemed to represent a different ideal of medieval kingship. Richard became the image of physical courage, battlefield command, and restless aggression. Saladin became the image of patience, political unity, and controlled authority. Both images contain truth, but both are also legends shaped by chroniclers. Richard could be brilliant and ruthless. Saladin could be generous and calculating. Neither was simply the noble hero later stories preferred. The central question can now be answered. Richard defeated Saladin in battle, but did not capture Jerusalem because courage could not overcome geography, supply, divided leadership, and time. Saladin kept Jerusalem, but could not eliminate the Crusader states because Richard restored the coast and made further attacks costly. Their contest ended where victory became more dangerous than compromise. The Third Crusade was therefore neither a complete Christian failure nor a complete Muslim triumph. Along the Mediterranean coast, ships entered Acre. Pilgrims traveled toward Jerusalem, and soldiers repaired walls for wars still to come. Inland, Saladin's banners remained above the holy city. Far away, Richard sat in captivity while Europe raised the price of his return. The two rulers never met face to face, yet history placed them opposite each other for centuries. Their struggle endured because neither destroyed the other. It ended with a treaty, a narrow coastline, an open road for pilgrims, and the recognition that even the most celebrated kings could reach the edge of victory and be forced to stop.